Hey pals, welcome to the wolf tutorial. Originally this was going to be combined with the fox tutorial, but I decided to go ahead and separate them out. If you have not seen the fox tutorial already, it is available here on Patreon and I would recommend checking it out. There are some similar principles in drawing both foxes and wolves and other animals for that matter, so both tutorials should help you out, I hope. When you draw wolves, it can be easy to accidentally make your wolf look like a different animal. I know I run into this quite a lot. And a lot of that has to do with the proportions in the face and the body. So I just want to take a second to talk about what makes a wolf look like a wolf and not a fox or a domesticated dog or even a bear, because yeah, sometimes you can go too much in the opposite direction and accidentally make your wolf look like a bear. I've done it before. It's a weird experience. But anyway, wolves tend to have longer and thicker snouts than foxes and even most domesticated dogs. There are some dogs that very closely resemble wolves, like huskies and Czech wolf dogs, but we are going to do our best to identify some shapes that help distinguish a wild wolf from types of dogs. Sharper face angles and triangle shapes. A shape that I associate heavily with wolves is the triangle and diamond shapes in their facial features. The way a wolf's snout swoops down is a little more angular than a domesticated dog's snout. A domesticated dog's snout might be a little bit more either round or square especially if you're comparing dogs that look pretty close to wolves. If you compare their pictures side by side, you might notice that the domesticated dog snout is still either a little bit more like square and blocky or a little bit softer, whereas a wolf has that more crisp, angled diamond or triangle shape to their snout. Also, the angle of wolves' eyes tends to at least appear a little more angular than the roundness of a dog's eyes. And even the way a wolf's fur frames their face tends to have a very angular diamond shape. These angles and sharper shapes communicate more danger than the round or blocky shapes in domesticated dogs. It shows that wolves are wild and not necessarily friendly to us humans like dogs are. What about the body? Wolves tend to have thicker necks than domesticated dogs, and they are a lot more bulky than foxes. Their body is going to be a lot thicker than a fox's body. In a wolf, you're not looking for that really like lean sort of, that lean flexible shape that a fox has. In a wolf, it's going to be a lot more like blocky, like they are full of muscle. Also, if you have seen the animated film Balto, you might remember what a big deal was made of a wolf having large paws. Wolves tend to have pretty massive paws compared to most other canines that I can think of. Remember in the fox tutorial when I said you can sometimes stylize a fox by not even drawing much of a paw and just having kind of the legs swoop down to a point because foxes' paws are pretty tiny? Well, we are definitely not going to be doing that with a wolf. Big paws are a really good way to show that this is a wolf. Let's quickly draw a basic wolf howling at the moon and take a look at those basic shapes. So, funny enough, a good line of action for a wolf howling at the moon could be part of a circle. So shout out to Harriet Muller for noticing this. It was a really interesting fact and it works really well. Okay, so once I have a circle for the line of action, I mean, you're not using the whole circle, just part of the circle, I'm going to use the bean method, which we used in the fox tutorial and we've used in the dynamic poses tutorial. So I just draw a big circle for the chest, a slightly smaller circle for like the butt and hips, and an even smaller circle for the head. And since the wolf is howling and it fits so well inside this big circle, all of my circles can more or less follow like the big line of action circle. Then I connect my little circles together to create that bean, or I guess the torso creates the bean and then you're just kind of connecting the head to the body with the neck. Remember that the neck is thick, like the neck is thicker than the wolf's head. For the muzzle, the basic shape is a kind of rectangle attached to the smallest circle. And for the legs, even though they are covered in fur, it can be a little tricky to see where all the joints are when the legs are straight. I want to at least try and map out where the joints exist, even if it means I have to kind of imagine where they are. If you need to look up some skeleton reference, that can be helpful if you're not quite sure where those joints should be landing in the legs. Okay, now that I've mapped out this kind of test run on top of the photo, let's try and draw it without tracing. So drawing this big circle for the line of action, and then the front, like, slightly larger circle for the rib cage, the torso basically, and then the butt circle, the butt/hip circle that's a little bit smaller, and then the head circle, which is even smaller than the butt circle, and they all just follow this this bigger circle, and then connecting the torso with some lines. Actually in a wolf, now that I think about it, it doesn't really look much like a bean because there's no dip between the two circles. In a fox there's a dip, in humans there's a dip, but in this wolf, unless the wolf is like maybe really lean, it seems like there's not so much of a dip between, so it doesn't look too much like a bean actually, but it's still the same process. Okay, so adding the muzzle, which is just a little square shape attached to the circle, and then kind of a triangle shape for the. And now roughing in the legs, and I'm being pretty loose here and still kind of trying to keep in mind where the joints will be. Again, for these front legs, when they're straight, it's kind of hard to tell exactly, but for the back legs, it's pretty easy. So I just kind of draw that thigh muscle, I guess it's a thigh muscle, and then from there's a joint down to the ankle, and then another joint that goes down to the foot. So just blocking in these rough shapes. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be clean. It's just to make sure we get the pose generally in there and try and make sure we have sort of the right proportions, and then just blocking in the tail. Now for the tail on a wolf, it's kind of like a fox, it can be a little bit puffy, but it's not nearly to the same extent as how puffy a fox's tail is, and it's not as long either. So you don't want to go too crazy with the wolf tails. And then also, here I am just very quickly indicating the paws, and remember that the paws on a wolf are very large, so you can make sure to make them, decently sized. And then from here, it's just time to start adding a little bit more clean lines and details. So I just lowered the opacity of the sketch, and now I am adding in a little bit more of a careful drawing. It probably still is not going to be perfect, it's just a little bit of a more cleaned up sketch, and using that reference to add in those details now that I have the very basic shape blocked in from the first layer. So the mouth is open a little bit, so I'm trying to match the reference of the wolf with the mouth open, and with the mouth open, you can kind of see how you can see a little bit of the inside of the mouth on the upper, I want to say upper lip, but it's not the upper lip, but hopefully you understand what I mean. And then when I'm doing kind of the shapes of the wolf, I do want to make sure I'm not just adding too many curves, because remember, this is an animal that is, not super friendly, especially, well, not most of the time, not to humans, not to livestock. So I want to use a mixture of angles and straight lines. And that's also just kind of a principle of good design, is to use straights versus curves. So it's still a little bit rough. I mean, I mentioned it before in the previous tutorial that I'm no expert when it comes to drawing animals, since I usually draw people. However, when you have the right reference, when you have reference and you're looking at it a lot, you can kind of draw anything. That's definitely something I've learned over the years. But anyway, I moved the muzzle to make the muzzle a little bit longer. You may have noticed that shift there. I just used the lasso tool to grab it and move it out a little bit, because I had initially drawn the muzzle a little bit too short for a wolf. It looked more like maybe some sort of cat or a dog with a little bit of a shorter muzzle. But you have to make sure that that muzzle is long enough for a wolf. It's something that's pretty important about their proportions. For how I tend to draw fur, or I don't usually like to draw every single hair on an animal. That will get like very, very messy. But I like to kind of indicate that there's fur here and there. And like I mentioned in the fox tutorial, one way I like to do that is to draw kind of a chunk of hair and then just add little like slices or cuts into it. So it will be kind of a blocky shape actually, with just a few cutouts to indicate the fur. I think it's more important, at least when you're starting out, to get the overall shape of the animal before worrying too much about all of the fur. Like, obviously the fur is very important to wolves because they have this very like kind of puffy, almost mane on their neck. It's part of what makes their neck so like big compared to their head. Speaking of the neck, I feel like on this wolf I drew, his neck could probably use a little bit of lengthening. It could be a little bit longer. But oh well. The point is, focus on the main shapes of your animal, rather than getting distracted by every single little hair. Once you have the main shapes in, you can always add more detail if you need more detail of the fur. And also, when you are drawing fur or indicating that there's fur there, take note of in your reference what direction the fur is like flowing to. Often the fur can help communicate the volumes of the animal that it's covering. And it should. The fur should not confuse the volumes, if that makes sense. You don't want the fur to cover it up and make your animal look like flat. You want the fur to help show that the animal is like a 3D thing. Okay, I'm gonna let this howling wolf, this basic howling wolf guy, we're gonna move him over to the side, and I want to talk a little bit about drawing. So we're gonna do another little draw over and talk again about those kind of triangle and diamond shapes. So the first thing, I just want to point out some proportions so we can kind of wrap our brains around the wolf. So I start out with drawing the center line because this wolf is facing forward, and then the eye line. From there, I am drawing a triangle shape to indicate the top, up to the top of the head, and then out to the edges of the head. I know it's a little strange. This isn't how I normally will draw a wolf from scratch, because I like to indicate a skull for like most animals, but I think this shows some good like proportions of what's happening in a wolf face. So the edge of that top triangle is kind of the fur as it flares out of the face shape. And then I also drew two lines that cut down the sides of the triangle to show kind of the edge of the actual face, like if the wolf did not have a bunch of fluff. It's not perfect, but it's kind of the skull that's like poking out through the fur. And then we're connecting the diamond down at the bottom of the wolf's snout. So from there, you will notice that you can draw the eyes out along that eye line, and then along that same line is the top of the snout, where the snout basically meets the skull between the eyes. And then drawing another triangle down to where the snout kind of angles down, and then making more of like a boxy shape to indicate the snout coming out at you. So you can kind of already see that a wolf's face is pretty angular, as opposed to maybe some like softer doggos that are out there. From here, I'm going to draw another diamond-esque sort of shape to indicate this extra tuft of fur that frames the wolf's face. If you'll notice in these wolves, they kind of have multiple layers of fur that sort of frame their face, especially now. This changes depending on the season, guys. So it's true that wolves are not always like super duper fluffy, but in the winter they're extra fluffy, and they still have fur in the summer, it's just maybe not quite as fluffy. But generally there are multiple layers of fur that kind of frame a wolf's face, kind of like a mane almost, but it extends all the way down their neck. For the ears, these are some good measurements to take note of. The inside edge of the ear, almost somewhat approximately lines up with the inside of the eye, if you see that little measurement down there. And then the edge of the ear, where it connects down, it somewhat, approximately lines up with the point of that inside triangle, the face triangle. And then the inside of the eyes line up with somewhat, approximately, it's all approximation, maybe not perfectly, but about where the nose is. So the edges of the nose kind of line up with the inside, the corners of the eyes. And remember, a wolf's nose is pretty big. It's a pretty wide nose. So that's very important to keep in mind. If it's wider than like a fox nose, it's wider than quite a few canines. So you have to make sure to make that nose wide enough, or your wolf might read more like a fox or more like a different type of dog. But a wolf's nose and muzzle is almost as wide as a bear's. Now, if you push it too wide, it will start looking like a bear, and that's when you need to narrow it back in again. But until you reach that point, it's a good thing to know so that you're not making your muzzles too narrow. All right, let's try and draw this wolf ourselves without doing a trace over. So I think these trace overs are very helpful to start out, just to get it in your brain, these kind of proportions. But then it's very important to come over and even be right next to it and kind of redraw it on your own. It's not completely on your own because you're still using reference, of course. However, it is a good exercise to do a trace over and then right next to it, see if you can draw it again. See how close you get. It's not going to be perfect. You'll see here as I demonstrate. This is not going to be perfect. I'm going to need to make a lot of adjustments probably, but it's still a good exercise to really get this knowledge in your brain. So I highly recommend doing this. First do a little trace over and then right next to it freehand it. So I'm trying to remember all of these proportions and draw these guides. So we have our top triangle that's a little diamond, the bottom triangle, and then the edges of the face that kind of cut the sides of the triangle out. And now I'm going to try and draw that second sort of diamond-ish shape that's the outside of the the wolves. Sorry, excuse me. I'm still recovering from the wolf's fur that frames his face, the mane. So I decided to add a symmetrical ruler just so we can move through this a little bit easier and a little bit quicker. So if you are not familiar with the symmetrical ruler, that's what that line now is in the center. If you just go to the ruler tool and then you can find symmetrical ruler and choose two sides and you can make this sort of symmetrical drawing. So you only have to draw one half. It's very convenient, especially for things like this where you're doing some sort of portrait that's straight on. Anyway, drawing in this this muzzle, I think I probably drew it too big and I'm going to need to adjust it. Actually, some proportions you can actually notice from here. This is a good observation to see how I mess up and need to change stuff as well when I'm still learning how to draw these animals and the proportions aren't perfectly in my brain. But the nose actually looks like it's a little bit too long, and if you'll notice, the top of the head looks like it's way too short, so that's going to need to be changed. But we have the basic proportions in there, and once you have the basic proportions in, you can get those eyes drawn in, and then we can change anything that we need to as we notice it. As you go, as you notice things that are messed up, don't be afraid to change them. It is being able to fix your mistakes even partway through the process is a very important difference between I guess I don't want to sound harsh, but I would say a lazy artist, and I'm not lazy artist. But what I mean is it's more experienced artist. I think a more experienced artist has the patience to go back and like change things if they need to. Whereas an impatient artist, who maybe often that means like less experienced, at least in my experience, is an artist who doesn't want to go back and doesn't take the time to change things. So being patient can really take your art to the next level. Being patient enough to make those corrections, even if they take a little bit of extra time. Anyway, I tangented a little bit, but so I moved the top of the head up a little bit, but I think I'm going to need to do it again. Another correction I want to make to my drawing here is I made the muzzle too long, so I'm shortening it a bit. Hopefully this won't be too short. We will see. And then I'm just going to clean up a bit so I can see a little bit better. You can start out with these guidelines, but if you need to erase them to really see what's going on once you have more of your drawing drawn in, that's totally fine. It's kind of up to you and how you work and how you sketch. But I think I'm going to start... let's bring it a little bit bigger, and then I'm going to start adding in a little bit of a finer sketch with a new layer, although I think I'm still gonna, the head is looking a little wide, so I think I am going to need to adjust some proportions again, especially with now the muzzle short. It makes it very obvious that the head is probably a bit too wide, and I think that will become very apparent as I start adding in a little bit more details. So I'm sketching in the nose. By the way, with the nose and the nostrils and stuff, make sure you're really looking at your reference, especially if you are not familiar or as familiar with drawing animals. The way that the nostrils are shaped, I mean, it's different than I would imagine. So it's just one of those things that you think you know how it's shaped, but then it's not necessarily stored in your brain. So make sure you're looking at reference so that you get the nostrils right, and you know, everything else as well. Of course, this goes for everything, but nostrils are just one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, I think I know how to draw a nostril, but then you look at reference and you actually don't know how to draw a nostril on this type of animal. So from personal experience, make sure you're looking at reference when looking at nostril shapes. So something that I'm also trying to keep in mind as I'm starting to draw in a little bit more details for my wolf is, as I'm adding in these tufts of fur, again, you can see I'm kind of adding the fur in as sort of like chunks. I'm not drawing every single hair in the fur. I'm trying to make like clumps of fur, and sometimes there's not even like a break in the shape. What's more important to me is to get the shapes, and then I can always add more like fur details later if I need them. But something I was starting to notice as I was adding fur to this guy was this guy's looking like a bear a little bit. He's looking a little bit like a bear, and the reason bear. The reason I think that this wolf was starting to look like a bear is he was too short. Since I shortened the snout, I shortened it a little too much, first of all. So it needed to be a little bit longer, and then also just generally everything was too wide. When I think of a bear, everything's like really wide and like quite chonky. Things are like that it's like that with a wolf too, but just not quite as wide. There's a very fine line with these animals. It's like too thin and it's looking too much like a cat, too wide and it's looking too much like a bear. There's this fine line, and sometimes you have to play around with it to get that fine line correct. But something else, this is going a little bit more into stylization now. So remember all of those diamond shapes? When I started adding the fur and like the roundness to the face, I was losing those diamond shapes. So now I'm trying to work in a little bit more of that the diamonds, the angles, the sharpness into my wolf again, to try and bring a little bit more of that back in that I had lost when I added the fur details. It's one of those things. It's easy to lose when you start adding in more and more and more details. You start losing the overall shape if you're not very careful, which I was so focused on just trying to get proportions correct with this guy that I wasn't being as careful as I should have been to maintain those diamond shapes in his face. And so I'm going to slowly try and work at least them back in a little bit, even if it's not perfect, so that we at least have something that looks more like a wolf, less like a bear. Some reference, I mentioned this in the Fox tutorial, but some reference that I really like to look at for how other artists handle drawing wolves, because, you know, photo reference is like king, right? Like that's the best reference you can look at is photo reference, but sometimes it's nice to get a little bit of inspiration for how do other artists handle simplifying certain things so that you don't have to figure it all out on your own. And some artistic reference that I really like to look at for things like wolves and foxes is tattoo art, specifically black and white, like line art style tattoos. I think that tattoo artists are really, really good at animal stylization in a really cool way and communicating that with line. So I highly recommend doing just a little search like wolf tattoo or fox tattoo or whatever. You might be really inspired. I know I am when I look at that stuff. Okay, so now that we've drawn a very basic like wolf howling at the moon and wolf portrait, I'm gonna try and tackle something a little bit more tricky. I found this reference of this wolf who is like very long, as weird as that sounds, but you can see in this wolf the very distinct kind of longer face that doesn't really look like a domesticated dog. It's very obvious that this is like, it looks more like a wolf, and also those big paws and long legs. So I'm going to try and draw this wolf using that same method. So I kind of did a line of action for the head and spine, and not exactly the spine, but you know, the line of action. And then I drew the larger circle for the chest, the smaller circle for the butt, and then the circle for the head. But this is a very tricky angle that I am struggling with for this head. And of course I accidentally drew the head too big initially, so I shrunk it down. And for this guy, since his head is angled, the muzzle was really like causing me problems. So you get to watch me struggle bus with this for a little bit as I kind of try and find the face in this guy. And sometimes these angles are really tricky, and it takes some trial and error and some. At first I was trying to do like underdrawing and use kind of a box to find this muzzle, but then I found that for this guy it was actually just, especially since I was sketching pretty small, easier to try and just go for it and find it by using my kind of typical sketching method, which is to sort of messily draw and erase and sort of carve away until I find the shape that I want. So yeah, this portion of the tutorial I guess is not exactly tutorial-ish, it's more you get to watch me struggle to draw a wolf and find the features. But I did get the rough sketch at least to a point where I felt like I could start adding in a little bit of more details and a nicer sketch. I feel like this wolf is looking almost like a corgi in the face at the moment, so that's not ideal. See, there's this very fine line where your wolf can suddenly start to look like a very friendly domesticated dog, especially if you have a tendency like me to draw lots of cute things. So here is my cute wolf. I did try just now resizing the head down because the head is pretty big, and then also making it a little bit like squished lengthwise. I have a tendency to make the heads all too wide, just like in the previous drawing, so making it a little bit narrower I think helps a bit. But also I was thinking for this guy I want to use a lot of angles, so you can see that I'm trying to use a lot of sharp lines like in the body, because I felt like it suited this guy pretty well, and it helps him feel a little bit more, like I was saying earlier, wild. Also, I lengthened the snout, if you've noticed, and that helped him feel a lot more like a wolf, so that's good. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, here is another kind of tricky one, but I really, really liked this wolf because this wolf really had a good emphasis in that like diamond-shaped face that I wanted to try and capture, and I'm going to try and do it in a somewhat stylized manner. So Because this wolf is kind of in a little bit of perspective in the body, I'm trying to show that. So the front circle of the rib cage, kind of, I use it also as a perspective indicator. It overlaps the body where the body connects to the back circle for the butt. And then the head, I did draw a little circle for the head, but overlaying that is that very diamond shaped face. This wolf is just so dang pretty. And then the legs, I indicated them with some very rough kind of stick figure motion lines. And the paws on this wolf are also very distinct and very large, so I also want to show those off. But for a while I want to focus on trying to get this face right, because I think it's very distinct and very important. And so I'm going to struggle bus a little bit with this nose to try and get it right. The first one I drew, I think, ended up looking a little bit too wide again, but this one might be a little bit too narrow. So something that I ended up having to distinguish between and really pay attention to the reference in is that the dark part of the nose isn't like the edge of the nose. That's the dark part of the nose is just the top part of the muzzle, and then it slopes down to the edges. So I tried to indicate that in the sketch as well. But now filling out the sketch in the legs, where I had indicated with just the stick figure kind of legs, and now I'm using the liquify tool to just move stuff around, because I think I drew the butt a little bit too high. But I like the general motion of this sketch, so I'm going to just come in and do a couple of adjustments, and now we're going to draw a little bit more of a refined sketch. And I want to get in a little bit closer while I draw this and really focus on these shapes. I don't want to get too detailed with fur and stuff with this guy. So if you guys have seen Cartoon Saloon, I don't know if any of you know what Cartoon Saloon is. They did like Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea. They have a I can't remember what it's called, but they have a wolf one. Oh, I should really look it up, what the name is, before I start rambling about it. But they have a very, very good movie about wolves. It's an animated movie, fabulous stylized wolves. I highly recommend checking it out. And the face of this wolf made me think about that movie, and also the legs and the proportion of the legs with the feet. I think they did an amazing job at stylizing their wolves. So I definitely recommend checking it out. I feel like the style that I drew here, it's not perfectly matching that, but once I drew it, I realized, oh, it might be kind of influenced by that movie. But the basics of stylizing this guy is to just pay attention to the shapes, basically, and really emphasize the shapes of this animal, which is those kind of diamond sort of shapes. And that is my basic drawing wolves tutorial. Now, when it comes to coloring, I'm not going to get super into like in-depth fur painting in this tutorial. I feel like that needs its whole own tutorial, but I'll kind of show you a little bit of painting this guy. So what I recommend when it comes to deciding on like wolf patterns and stuff is look at a lot of reference, see how patterns happen in nature, because wolves have a lot of different fur patterns that you can choose from, and you can, even if you're going with like some sort of fantasy wolf, you should base it off of reality at least a little bit to be inspired by reality. And then the way that I'm tackling painting fur generally is, again, not paying attention to every single little strand, but I'm still more focusing on just sculpting the volumes at this point. So I am sculpting the volumes with kind of a blocky brush. I will include the brush that I'm using in this painting part in the post, because it's a really fun brush. It's kind of a textured blocky brush, and it was really fun to paint with. So I will make sure to include that for you guys. But yeah, basically I just focus on sculpting and then add a little bit of fur detail here and there as like tufts, but nothing too like detailed. And I think that that's the look that I generally like when I see artwork with painted fur, is more sculpting, not so much super detailed fur. It's what I find most satisfying. Anyway, I hope this tutorial was helpful for you guys. I know I'm no expert when it comes to painting animals or wolves, but this is the process that I tend to use. I've kind of found that as long as you have good reference, you can basically draw anything and break it down into like basic shapes. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for all your support and making these tutorials possible. Could not do it without you guys. And this is our second tutorial of the month. Barely squeezed it in, but we got it done. Excited for future tutorials. Expect a new tutorial poll coming soon, so you guys can help decide on the next tutorial. If you have suggestions, please drop a comment. I always love it when you guys give me tutorial suggestions, so I know what you're interested in learning. Okay, enough rambling. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye!